Sarah Martinez wiped the tears from her eyes as she walked through the hospital corridors for the last time. The familiar smell of disinfectant and the sound of beeping machines would no longer be part of her daily routine. After 15 years as a dedicated nurse at St. Mary's General Hospital, her world had just crumbled in a single afternoon. The pink slip in her hand felt heavier than any medical equipment she had ever carried. Budget cuts, they said. Downsizing due to financial constraints. 23 nurses were being let go, and Sarah was one of them. The irony wasn't lost on her that during a global health crisis, hospitals were cutting medical staff. Sarah had always been the one her colleagues turned to during emergencies. She could start in 4 on the most difficult patients, calm anxious families with just the right words, and work double shifts without complaint. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, had tears in her eyes when she delivered the news. "Sarah, this isn't about your performance," Mrs. Chen had said, her voice shaking. "You're one of our best nurses." But the board made the decision based on seniority and department needs. At 42, Sarah felt too young to be starting over and too old to be confident about finding another position quickly. The job market for nurses had become surprisingly competitive, with many hospitals implementing hiring freezes. She had a mortgage to pay, her teenage daughter Emma's college fund to think about, and now no steady income. Walking to her car in the parking garage, Sarah felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. She had always been the stable one in her family. After her divorce 3 years ago, she had worked extra shifts to maintain their lifestyle. Emma was a senior in high school, with dreams of becoming a doctor. Sarah had promised her daughter that money wouldn't be an obstacle to her education. The drive home to their small suburban house felt longer than usual. Sarah lived in a quiet neighborhood where most families had lived for decades. The houses were modest but well-maintained, with small front yards and friendly neighbors who waved from their porches. It was the kind of place where people looked out for each other, but Sarah had always been too proud to ask for help. Emma was in the kitchen doing homework when Sarah walked through the front door. Her daughter looked up with a bright smile that quickly faded when she saw her mother's expression. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emma asked, closing her textbook. Sarah had rehearsed this conversation during the drive home, but now the words seemed to stick in her throat. How do you tell your child that the security they've known all their life has just vanished? "Honey, I need to tell you something," Sarah began, sitting down at the kitchen table across from Emma. "The hospital had to make some difficult decisions today. They're cutting staff, and I was one of the nurses who lost their job." Emma's face went pale. "But you're the best nurse there." "Everyone says so. Mrs. Patterson from down the street always talks about how you took such good care of her when she had surgery." "Sometimes being good at your job isn't enough," Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "But don't worry. I'll find something else. I just need you to know that things might be tight for a while." Emma nodded, but Sarah could see the worry in her daughter's eyes. They both knew that a while could stretch longer than either of them wanted to admit. That evening, Sarah sat at her laptop searching job websites. Every position seemed to require experience she didn't have or offered salaries that wouldn't cover their basic expenses. The rejection letters from her previous applications had already started arriving in her email inbox. Each one felt like another door closing. The house felt too quiet. Usually, Sarah would be getting ready for her night shift at this time, checking her supplies and mentally preparing for the long hours ahead. Instead, she found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had changed so quickly. Her phone buzzed with text messages from former colleagues who had heard the news. Their words of support were kind, but they couldn't pay the bills. Sarah's savings account had enough to cover maybe 2 months of expenses if she was careful. After that, she would have to consider selling the house or taking Emma out of her school district. The neighborhood around her had always been a source of comfort. From her bedroom window, she could see the Martinez family's house next door, where old Mr. Martinez spent his evenings tending to his prize-winning tomatoes. Across the street, the Johnson family had lived in the same house for 30 years, raising 4 children who had all gone on to successful careers. Sarah had bought this house when Emma was 5, choosing it specifically for the good schools and safe streets. She had imagined Emma growing up here, bringing friends home from school, and eventually graduating from the local high school before heading off to college. Now all of those plans seemed uncertain. As the night grew later, Sarah found herself on the internet reading articles about career changes and job hunting strategies for people over 40. The advice was encouraging but vague. Network with former colleagues. Consider temporary positions. Be open to new opportunities. None of it addressed the immediate panic of not knowing how to pay next month's mortgage. Emma knocked softly on her bedroom door around 10 o'clock. "Mom, I was thinking. Maybe I could get a part-time job to help out." Mrs. Rodriguez at the grocery store said they're always looking for people to work weekends. Sarah felt her heart break a little more. Emma was 17 and should be focused on her senior year, college applications, and spending time with friends. She shouldn't be worrying about family finances. "That's sweet of you to offer, honey," Sarah replied, "but your job right now is school. I'll figure this out." But, lying in bed that night, Sarah wasn't sure how she would figure it out. She had always been the type of person who had a plan, who prepared for contingencies. The divorce had taught her to be financially cautious, and she thought she had built enough of a safety net to handle unexpected situations. She had never imagined losing her job during a time when healthcare workers were supposedly in high demand. The neighborhood was completely quiet except for the occasional car driving by. Through her window, Sarah could see a few houses with lights still on. She wondered if any of her neighbors were lying awake with similar worries. The economic uncertainty seemed to be affecting everyone, from young families just starting out to retirees on fixed incomes. Sarah had never been the type of person to feel sorry for herself for long. Even during the difficult months following her divorce, she had focused on moving forward and creating stability for Emma. But tonight, in the darkness of her bedroom, she allowed herself to feel scared about the future. Tomorrow, she would start making phone calls to other hospitals in the area. She would update her resume and reach out to nursing agencies. She would put on a brave face for Emma and tackle this challenge the same way she had handled every other difficult situation in her life. But tonight, she permitted herself to grieve for the life that had just been taken away from her. The last thing Sarah remembered before falling asleep was the sound of an airplane passing overhead, its lights blinking against the dark sky. She had no way of knowing that aircraft would soon play a significant role in changing her life's direction. For now, it was just another sound in the night, like the gentle wind rustling through the trees or the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Sarah's dreams that night were filled with hospital corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, with doors that wouldn't open no matter how hard she tried to turn the handles. She woke up several times, momentarily forgetting about the job loss before the reality crashed back over her like a cold wave. When morning came, Sarah lay in bed for a few extra minutes, gathering the strength to face the first day of her new, uncertain reality. Through her window, she could see the sun rising over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the street. It was the beginning of what would be the most challenging and ultimately transformative period of her life, though she had no way of knowing that yet. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah lost her job, and the reality of unemployment was setting in harder than she had expected. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grinding daily routine of job applications, phone calls, and rejections. She had applied to every hospital within a 50-mile radius, contacted nursing agencies, and even considered positions in doctors' offices and urgent care centers. The responses were consistently disappointing. Some places weren't hiring at all. Others wanted nurses with specialized certifications that Sarah didn't have. A few offered per diem work with no guaranteed hours and no benefits. Sarah realized she had been naive to think that 15 years of experience would make her immediately employable in any healthcare setting. Emma had become quieter around the house, and Sarah noticed her daughter spending more time in her room doing homework or talking quietly on the phone with friends. The college acceptance letters had started arriving, and each one brought a mix of pride and anxiety. Emma had been accepted to 3 universities, including her dream school, but the financial aid packages weren't nearly enough to cover the costs. "Mom, maybe I should consider the community college route for the first 2 years, Emma had suggested one morning over breakfast. "Absolutely not," Sarah had replied firmly. You worked too hard to compromise on your education now. I'll figure something out. But, privately, Sarah was running out of ideas. Her unemployment benefits had finally started coming through, but they covered less than half of her previous salary. She had already called the mortgage company to discuss a temporary payment reduction, sold her car and bought a used one with cash, and started shopping at discount grocery stores. The neighborhood had begun to feel different to Sarah during her long days at home. She noticed things she had never paid attention to during her busy working life. Mrs. Patterson from down the street walked her small dog 3 times a day, always at exactly the same times. The Henderson family across the street seemed to be having marriage problems, based on the loud arguments that occasionally drifted across the yard. The house 2 doors down had been for sale for 6 months with no buyers. Sarah had also become aware of how much air traffic passed over their neighborhood. She had never noticed it before when she was rushing to work or busy with hospital duties, but now she found herself looking up every time she heard the sound of aircraft engines. Some were clearly commercial flights heading to the nearby regional airport, but others seemed different. Military aircraft, perhaps, though she couldn't be sure. One afternoon, while Sarah was in her backyard hanging laundry to save money on the electric bill, she heard a particularly loud aircraft approaching. The sound was deeper and more powerful than the usual passenger planes. She looked up to see a large gray military helicopter flying low over the neighborhood. The helicopters circled the area twice before heading toward what Sarah realized must be the old Morrison building downtown. She had heard rumors that the city was trying to attract new businesses to the abandoned office complex, but nothing concrete had materialized. The sight of military aircraft in their quiet suburban area was unusual enough that several neighbors had come out of their houses to watch. "That's the 3rd one this week," called out Mr. Martinez from his garden next door. "Third what?" Sarah asked, walking over to the fence that separated their yards. "Military helicopter. My grandson works for the city planning department. Says they're doing some kind of feasibility study for a new project, but nobody knows what kind of project." Sarah found herself more curious about the helicopters than she probably should have been. Maybe it was because she had too much time on her hands, or maybe it was because anything that broke up the monotony of job hunting was welcome. But, over the next few days, she started paying closer attention to the aircraft activity in the area. Her observation skills, honed by years of monitoring patients and noticing small changes that could indicate bigger problems, kicked in automatically. The helicopters weren't random. They followed patterns. Most came from the same direction, flew similar routes over the neighborhood, and seemed to be surveying specific areas rather than just passing through. Sarah mentioned her observations to Emma that evening while they were eating dinner. "Maybe they're planning to build something," Emma suggested. "Like a new hospital or government building." The word hospital made Sarah's heart skip. She had been so focused on applying to existing healthcare facilities that she hadn't considered the possibility of new construction projects that might need medical staff. That night, Sarah did something she hadn't done since losing her job. She felt a spark of curiosity that had nothing to do with her desperate job search. She researched military helicopter activity, city planning records, and construction permits for their area. What she found was frustrating but intriguing. There were several pending applications for federal development projects in and around the old Morrison building, but the details were vague. The paperwork mentioned multi-use facility and emergency preparedness training, but nothing more specific. The timeline showed that final approvals were expected within the next month. Sarah's nursing background had taught her to piece together incomplete information to form a bigger picture. Patients didn't always tell her everything, and symptoms didn't always point to obvious diagnoses. She had learned to look for patterns and make educated guesses based on limited data. The helicopter activity, the government permits, the location of the Morrison building near both the hospital district and the highway access, all pointed to something bigger than a simple office renovation. Sarah began to suspect that whatever was being planned might involve emergency services or healthcare facilities. She spent the next morning researching federal emergency management programs and disaster preparedness initiatives. What she discovered was that the government had been investing heavily in regional emergency response centers since the pandemic had exposed weaknesses in the country's healthcare infrastructure. The more Sarah read, the more convinced she became that the Morrison Building project might be related to emergency medical services. If that was true, it could mean job opportunities for healthcare workers with her background. Emergency preparedness programs typically needed nurses with broad experience rather than specialized certifications. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of hope that wasn't based on desperate optimism. This was different. This was a lead worth investigating. She called the city planning office that afternoon. "I'm calling about the federal development projects near the Morrison Building," she told the clerk who answered. "I'm sorry, but I can't provide specific information about those projects. You could try submitting a public records request, but most of the details are still confidential pending final approval." "Can you tell me if the project will involve healthcare or emergency services?" There was a pause. "Ma'am, I really can't discuss the details. But if you're interested in potential employment opportunities, you might want to keep an eye on federal job postings over the next few weeks." Sarah thanked the clerk and hung up, feeling more energized than she had since losing her job. She wasn't sure exactly what was being planned, but her instincts told her it was worth pursuing. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself spending more time outside, ostensibly working in her garden but actually observing the helicopter patterns. She had started keeping a notebook, recording the times, flight paths, and types of aircraft she saw. It was probably unnecessary, but it gave her something purposeful to do while she waited for more information. Emma had noticed the change in her mother's demeanor. "You seem different lately," she said one evening while they were washing dishes together. "Different how?" "Less worried, I guess. Like you're working on something instead of just waiting for something to happen." Sarah smiled. "I think I might be onto something. I can't explain it yet, but I have a feeling things are about to change." She was more right than she knew. The next morning, Sarah would wake up to the sound of helicopters landing much closer to her house than ever before. What seemed like a routine observation exercise was about to become something much more significant. As she fell asleep that night, Sarah felt a sense of anticipation that reminded her of the early days of her nursing career, when every shift brought new challenges and learning opportunities. She had no idea that the biggest challenge and opportunity of her professional life was literally about to land on her doorstep. The last helicopter of the day passed overhead just as Sarah was turning off her bedroom light. This time, instead of the distant hum she had grown accustomed to, the sound seemed to be getting closer rather than fading away. Much closer. The sound of rotor blades beating against the morning air jolted Sarah awake at exactly 6:30 a.m. But this wasn't the distant rumble she had grown accustomed to over the past few weeks. This was loud, immediate, and seemed to be directly overhead. Sarah rushed to her bedroom window and pulled back the curtains. What she saw made her heart race. A large Navy helicopter was descending toward the elementary school playground 3 blocks away, its landing creating a small dust storm that obscured her view temporarily. Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair messy from sleep. "Mom, what is that noise?" "A helicopter just landed at Lincoln Elementary," Sarah replied, already reaching for her clothes. "This is definitely not normal." Within minutes, Sarah was dressed and, outside, walking quickly toward the school. She wasn't the only one. Neighbors were emerging from houses all along the street, some still in bathrobes, others already dressed for work but clearly abandoning their morning routines to investigate. As Sarah got closer to the school, she could see that it wasn't just one helicopter. 3 military aircraft were now on the ground in the playground area, and uniformed personnel were setting up what looked like a field command center. Orange safety cones had been placed around the perimeter, and several official-looking vehicles had arrived. Mrs. Patterson was standing at the edge of the crowd that had gathered at the school fence, walking her small dog as always but clearly more interested in the military activity than her pet's morning routine. "Excuse me," Sarah said, approaching one of the uniformed officers near the fence. "I live in the neighborhood. Is everything all right? Is this some kind of emergency?" The young sailor looked at her with a professional smile.
No emergency, ma'am. This is a planned training exercise.
We're conducting a community preparedness assessment.
A community preparedness assessment for what?
Before the sailor could answer, an older officer approached them. His uniform bore the insignia of a lieutenant commander, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to being in charge.
Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, he said, extending his hand.
We're here as part of a federal initiative to evaluate communities for emergency response capabilities.
Are you a resident of this neighborhood?
Yes,
I live on Maple Street. I'm Sarah Martinez.
She shook his hand, noticing that his grip was firm and his manner was both professional and reassuring.
Emergency response for what kind of situations?
Natural disasters, medical emergencies, large-scale incidents that might require evacuation or temporary medical facilities.
We're assessing locations that could serve as emergency shelters or field hospitals if needed.
The words medical and field hospitals caught Sarah's attention immediately. Are you looking for healthcare workers? She asked, perhaps a bit too eagerly. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez studied her face more carefully.
Are you in healthcare? I'm a registered nurse.
15 years of experience in hospital emergency and trauma care. I just lost my position due to budget cuts at St. Mary's General. Something shifted in the officer's expression. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small notebook.
Mrs. Martinez, would you mind if I asked you a few questions about your medical background?
Of course. For the next 10 minutes, Sarah found herself being interviewed by a Navy officer in the parking lot of an elementary school while military helicopters sat nearby and her neighbors watched from behind the fence. The questions were thorough but not invasive. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez asked about her training, her experience with trauma cases, her ability to work under pressure, and her familiarity with emergency protocols.
Have you ever worked in field conditions or outside of traditional hospital settings? He asked.
I've volunteered with disaster relief organizations 3 times. Hurricane cleanup in Louisiana, earthquake response in California, and flood relief right here in our state 2 years ago. I'm certified in emergency field medicine and trauma response. Sarah had never been so grateful for those volunteer experiences, which she had pursued partly out of professional interest and partly because she felt a responsibility to use her skills to help people during crises.
Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez was taking notes rapidly. Mrs.
Martinez, what I'm about to tell you is not classified information, but we're asking people not to discuss it widely until we make an official announcement.
Would you be willing to keep this conversation confidential for now? Sarah nodded, feeling her pulse quicken.
The federal government is establishing regional emergency response centers in communities across the country.
These facilities will serve dual purposes: routine training for emergency personnel and rapid deployment sites during actual emergencies. The Morrison Building downtown is being converted into one of these centers. Sarah felt a rush of vindication. Her instincts had been right.
The facility will need a permanent medical staff with experience in both routine healthcare and emergency response. We're particularly interested in nurses with your background because field medicine requires adaptability and broad skills rather than narrow specialization.
Are you offering me a job? Sarah asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I'm offering you an opportunity to apply for a position that I think you'd be well suited for.
The pay scale is federal, which means it's probably better than most hospital positions.
The benefits are excellent. And the work would involve both routine preparedness training and response to actual emergencies when they occur.
Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. After weeks of rejection and uncertainty, a potential solution had literally landed in her neighborhood.
What would be the next steps? She asked.
There's a formal application process, background checks, and an interview with the medical team leader. But, based on our conversation and your background, I'd say your chances are very good. The position would start in about 6 weeks, as soon as the facility modifications are completed. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez handed her a business card with contact information and several forms. Fill these out and return them within 48 hours.
Someone will contact you within a week to schedule the formal interview process. Sarah took the paperwork, her hands trembling slightly. Thank you. This is exactly what I needed right now. Mrs. Martinez, can I ask you something? What made you come over here this morning instead of just watching from your house like most of your neighbors? Sarah thought about the question. I guess I've learned that opportunities don't usually come looking for you. If something unusual is happening, it's worth investigating.
And my nursing training taught me that sometimes you have to act on incomplete information and trust your instincts.
Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez smiled. Those are exactly the qualities we're looking for in our medical staff.
As Sarah walked back toward her house, clutching the application materials, she felt a mix of excitement and disbelief. The whole encounter felt surreal. She had gone from unemployed and desperate to having a potential federal job offer, all because she had paid attention to helicopter patterns and been curious enough to investigate.
Emma was waiting on the front porch when Sarah got home. Mom, what was that all about? You were gone for almost an hour.
Sarah sat down next to her daughter on the porch steps, still processing what had just happened. I think I might have just found a new job, she said slowly.
A good job. Maybe even a better job than the one I lost. Emma's eyes widened. Really? How?
Sometimes, honey, life has a way of working out in ways you never expect.
All those helicopters I've been watching? They were here to set up an emergency response center, and they need medical staff. Sarah looked at the application forms in her hands.
The salary range listed was indeed higher than what she had been making at the hospital. The benefits package included full healthcare, educational assistance for family members, and a retirement plan.
Does this mean I can still go to my first choice college? Emma asked quietly. If I get this position, yes. Definitely yes.
That evening, Sarah spread the application materials across her kitchen table and began filling them out with the same careful attention to detail she had always brought to patient charts. But, this time, instead of documenting someone else's recovery, she was documenting her own path back to financial stability and professional purpose. As she worked, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters departing the school playground. The training exercise was over, but, for Sarah, it felt like something new was just beginning. She had no way of knowing that the position she was applying for would eventually lead her to opportunities she had never imagined, but, for now, it was enough to know that her life was moving in a positive direction again. The irony wasn't lost on her that losing her job at the hospital had led her to discover this opportunity. If she had still been working her regular shifts, she never would have been home to notice the helicopter patterns or been available to investigate when they landed in her neighborhood. Sometimes, Sarah reflected as she signed her name to the application, the worst thing that happens to you creates the opening for the best thing that could happen to you. 2 months later, Sarah stood in the main medical bay of the newly operational Regional Emergency Response Center, wearing a crisp navy blue uniform that bore her name tag and the title Senior Field Medical Coordinator. The transformation of the old Morrison building had been remarkable. What was once a deteriorating office complex was now a state-of-the-art facility equipped with everything from basic medical supplies to sophisticated communications equipment. The interview process had been thorough but fair. Sarah had met with Dr. Rebecca Chen, the center's medical director, who turned out to be a former military physician with extensive experience in disaster response. During their 3-hour interview, they had discussed not just Sarah's technical qualifications but her ability to adapt quickly to changing situations and work effectively with people from different backgrounds. What impressed me most about your application, Dr. Chen had told her on the day she received the job offer, was that you took the initiative to investigate when you noticed something unusual in your neighborhood. That kind of curiosity and willingness to engage with unexpected situations is exactly what we need in field medical personnel. Sarah's salary was indeed higher than her previous hospital position, and the federal benefits package had resolved her worries about Emma's college expenses. The Educational Assistance Program would cover 60% of tuition costs for family members, and Sarah's improved financial situation meant they could handle the rest without hardship. Emma was now a freshman at her dream university, studying pre-medicine with hopes of becoming an emergency room physician. She had been inspired by her mother's career transition and had decided she wanted to work in crisis medicine rather than traditional practice. "I want to be the kind of doctor who shows up when things are falling apart," Emma had told Sarah during one of their weekly phone calls.
Like you did when you lost your job. You didn't just wait for something to happen. You made something happen.
The Emergency Response Center had become operational just in time. 3 weeks after Sarah started her position, a severe storm system had moved through the region, causing flooding that displaced hundreds of families. Sarah found herself coordinating medical care for evacuees who had been brought to temporary shelters, treating everything from minor injuries to chronic conditions of elderly residents who had been separated from their medications. Working alongside Navy medical personnel, Red Cross volunteers, and local emergency responders had been challenging but incredibly fulfilling. Sarah discovered that her hospital experience had prepared her well for the unpredictability of field medicine, but she was also learning new skills constantly. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, who had become a colleague and friend, often reminded Sarah that her hiring had been somewhat serendipitous. "We had identified your neighborhood for the community assessment because of its central location and demographics," he had told her during one of their training exercises. "But we weren't necessarily expecting to recruit medical staff directly from the community. Your willingness to engage with us that morning was exactly the kind of community connection we were hoping to build."
The job had turned out to be more varied and interesting than Sarah had anticipated.
In addition to emergency response duties, she was involved in community preparedness training, helping to educate local residents about basic disaster planning and first aid. She also worked with area hospitals to coordinate response protocols, which had led to her being invited to serve on a regional healthcare emergency planning committee. Perhaps most surprisingly, Sarah had discovered that she enjoyed the administrative and planning aspects of her work almost as much as direct patient care. She was naturally organized and detail-oriented, skills that translated well to logistics coordination and resource management during emergency responses. Dr. Chen had noticed Sarah's aptitude for planning and had begun involving her in the development of new response protocols. "You have an unusual combination of clinical experience and strategic thinking," she had told Sarah during her 3-month performance review.
"Have you ever considered pursuing additional training in emergency management?"
The suggestion had sparked Sarah's interest in returning to school herself. The federal educational benefits available to employees were generous, and she was exploring graduate programs in emergency and disaster management that she could complete while continuing to work. The irony of her situation was not lost on Sarah. Losing her job at the hospital, which had felt like a career catastrophe at the time, had led her to work that was more challenging, better compensated, and more aligned with her natural skills and interests than anything she had done before. Her neighborhood had also benefited from the Emergency Response Center's presence. The facility had brought federal investment to the area, leading to improvements in local infrastructure and the creation of additional jobs. The Morrison building had become a source of community pride rather than an eyesore, and property values in the surrounding area had increased. Mrs. Patterson, her neighbor with the small dog, had become something of a local celebrity for having been one of the first residents to notice the increased helicopter activity that preceded the center's establishment. She regularly told anyone who would listen that she had predicted something important was going to happen. Mr. Martinez next door had been hired as a part-time groundskeeper for the center, using his gardening expertise to maintain the landscaping around the facility. "Best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood," he told Sarah regularly. "Jobs, investment, and we all feel safer knowing there's an emergency response center right here." On quiet days at the center, Sarah sometimes looked out the windows toward her neighborhood and reflected on the series of events that had brought her to this point. If she had found another hospital job quickly after being laid off, she never would have been available to notice the helicopter patterns or investigate when they landed near her home. The timing had been perfect in a way that seemed almost orchestrated by fate. She had been desperate enough to pay attention to unusual activity in her area, experienced enough to be an attractive candidate for the position, and available to pursue the opportunity immediately.
Emma had pointed out another layer of irony during her last visit home.
"Mom, you always told me that nursing was about helping people during their most difficult moments. But it turned out that losing your job put you in position to help people on a much larger scale than you ever could have in one hospital."
Sarah had to agree.
Her work at the Emergency Response Center potentially impacted thousands of people across the region, rather than the dozens of patients she might have cared for during a hospital shift.
The scope of her influence had expanded dramatically.
Dr. Chen had recently approached Sarah about leading a team that would help establish similar emergency response centers in other regions. The position would involve travel and training responsibilities, working with communities across multiple states to build their emergency preparedness capabilities. "You have a unique perspective," Dr. Chen had explained. "You understand both the medical aspects of emergency response and the community dynamics involved in establishing these centers. We need people who can build bridges between federal programs and local communities."
Sarah was seriously considering the offer. Emma was settled at university and doing well.
The house in her neighborhood was now worth more than she owed on the mortgage, giving her financial flexibility she had never had before. And the work would build on everything she had learned over the past year while opening up entirely new possibilities for her career. As she finished her shift one evening and walked out to her car, Sarah looked up at the sky where she had first noticed the military helicopters that changed her life.
The irony made her smile every time she thought about it.
She had spent weeks watching aircraft activity, trying to piece together clues about what might be happening in her community. She had investigated when the helicopters finally landed near her home. She had asked questions and shown interest when she could have simply watched from a distance. But the most important decision had been the simplest one. When she heard unusual sounds that morning, she had gotten dressed and walked outside to see what was happening. That single choice to investigate rather than ignore something out of the ordinary had led to everything that followed. Now, as Sarah drove home through the neighborhood where her new life had begun, she thought about the advice she would give to other people facing unexpected career transitions.
Pay attention to your environment. Be curious about changes happening around you. Don't assume that opportunities will look like what you expect them to look like.
Most importantly, when something unusual happens, don't just watch it happen.
Get involved. Ask questions. Introduce yourself.
Sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as disruptions, and the biggest changes in your life can literally land on your doorstep if you're paying attention and brave enough to investigate when they do. Sarah had lost her job at the hospital, but she had gained something much more valuable, a career that challenged her, financial security for her family, and the satisfaction of knowing that her work made a real difference in her community's ability to respond to crises. The Navy helicopter that had landed in her neighborhood had indeed changed everything. But the real transformation had come from Sarah's willingness to engage with unexpected possibilities and trust that curiosity could lead to opportunity, even in the darkest moments of professional uncertainty.